they're more than just interconnected. They begin at the place of undifferentiated wholeness. This is where they begin. And so, a lot of these ideas that are in Chinese medicine, they got into my imaginative process in my brain, and then I dropped them down into my body. And basic ideas, like basic sentences, like human beings are the interplay between the descending forces from above and the ascending forces from below. Well, this is foundational to every patient I see, right? Because this really means that we manifest from this undifferentiated wholeness, right? And then we're one of the 10,000 things thinging. We're this thing. There was this day that I thought of the thought, well, we're not so much a thing to which events are happening, but rather a series of events that are thinging at any time.
I'm Michael Max, and this is Geological, the podcast that curates East Asian medicine and methods through the power of conversation. You are not the wizard we were looking for, but you're the wizard that we got, says Glinda to the conman come wizard in The Great and Powerful Oz, the one with Johnny Depp as the so-called wizard. How often are we faced with the disappointment of not getting exactly what we hoped for? Or, more to the point of our gentle hearts, how often have we not felt up to the task that was before us? Rarely are we fully formed and ready for the challenges that grow us deeper into integration. Most of us tremble at the gulf between what we feel ourselves capable of and what's actually being called for from us. It could be your job asking you to bring a higher level of skill and finesse, or maybe your relationships asking for a deeper level of connection and feeling that leaves you wondering if your well runs deep enough. It could be the very world itself asking you to take a stand when you feel like hiding, or your own failed expectations of yourself that is a reliable reminder that living your values is not a lesson that can be sidestepped or half-heartedly engaged. You are not the job, situation, the spouse, parent, sibling, offspring, friend, fill in the blank that I was looking for. But you're the one I got. You can wallow in anger, confusion, or disappointment. Tally the score that declares a winner and a loser. List the sins and shortcomings, and curse the terrible misfortune of having been delivered faulty goods and then attempt to make do with what you got. Or you can recognize that perhaps the story you've been telling leaves out the flawed genius of those you're closest to, or leaves out the hidden talents and unfolded potential overlooked within yourself. It is oh so easy to see what's missing. Hypnotize yourself with the mantra of lack and spin your life around that fulcrum of want. No, you may not have gotten the wizard that you were looking for, but wizards do have a way of revealing their secret powers, and usually not in the ways that you might expect. The character Qi in Qi Jing Ba Mai, or extraordinary vessels, as we say in English, in addition to meaning extraordinary, Qi also means strange or curious. And I, for one, have found them to be curious mostly in that I've had a hard time getting a feel for them. Sure, it's possible to grasp a theoretic understanding, but I find that unlike the 12 regular channels that I mostly feel like I have a personal relationship with these days, the extraordinary vessels, they remain a bit of a curiosity for me. Like a foreign language that hasn't become quite workable, but it feels like you're close. As is often the case, when I don't grasp something, I like to talk to people who have experience and familiarity. I was delighted to have been introduced to Daniel Atchison-Nevel. He's been working with the curious vessels for a long time now. And in this conversation, I think that I started to get it, that part of the trouble with understanding the influence of the Big Eight is, in part, because they are indeed primordial. I suspect they are more available to sensing than to thinking. At least, that's my current hypothesis. And indeed, some of Dan's fundamental learning came from a teacher with whom he did not share a common language, and yet he learned something about these vessels that is indeed extraordinary. We'll get into all of this in a moment. We'll be right back. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. It's Women's Health Month at Mayway Herbs. Check out their new website for learning resources on helping women with herbal medicine. Are you a creature of habit? How about making a change that helps your patients and the planet with AccuFast needles? And later in the show, raising your fees doesn't have to be a difficult process. Jane has helpful suggestions on making it easy and effective. And finally, have you considered that having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things that you can do? Julie Bear Don't Walk has, and she can help you do something about it too. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Qiological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients, and then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more.
Hi folks, I'm Yvonne Lyle, president of Mayway Herbs. May is Women's Health Month, and as a women-owned and women-run business, we especially love how Chinese medicine can support wellness through every stage of a woman's life. So in this month's newsletter and podcast, we're covering topics like PMS, pregnancy, menopause, and osteoporosis. We'll share expert insights and effective treatment strategies you can put to good use in your clinic. Our Plumflower brand line includes herbal tea pills, tablets, extract granules, and organic herbs, all of which you can find on Mayway.com, and where you can also find articles, videos, and other resources to support your practice. Since 1969, Mayway has been a trusted source for high-quality herbal products. In these challenging times, please know that we remain committed to keeping our products accessible and affordable so you can take care of yourself and your patients. As always, thank you for supporting Real Chinese Medicine.
Daily habits and routines feel comforting, familiar, easy, automatic. That's the power of repetition. You've worked out the kinks and can do it with your eyes closed. But what if you shook things up? What if you ditched the old routine and tried something new? Hi, I'm John Sten. I've practiced acupuncture for over 30 years, and together with my wife Kelly, we created the world's first eco-friendly acupuncture needle. The AccuFast earth-friendly needle system cuts your packaging waste by 60 to 90%, depending upon your needle type, speeds up your needling, gives you more control, and best of all, while you're healing patients, we plant a tree for every 2 boxes your clinic uses. Thousands of acupuncturists have already made the switch. In just the last year, they've helped plant over 16,000 trees. Since we started, that number has grown to over 50,000. So break the routine. Be the change. Visit AccuFastNeedles.com. Your patients and the planet will thank you.
Daniel Atchison-Nevel, welcome to Qiological.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to talking with you.
I am looking forward to this as well. Thank you for making some time to sit down. We're going to have a conversation. I don't know what we're going to have a conversation about. I always jump in with something, and then we see where it goes.
Great.
Where I'd love to begin is the 8 extraordinary vessels. You know, it's funny. I was just thinking this morning, getting ready to talk with you. Sometimes people call them the extraordinary vessels. That gives you a certain feeling tone. Sometimes people call them the 8 extras. That gives you a different, at least for me, it's a different feeling tone. In Chinese, they're called the Qi Jing Ba Mai. You could make a case for them being called the strange flows.
Yeah, definitely. Curious.
Curious. Yeah, the curious vessels. And you've been using these. I was looking at your website. You use them to, in particularly, treat depression, anxiety, things like this. That's interesting. There's tons of that around these days. I'd like to begin with when you first started noticing that there's something about these extraordinary vessels. And like, what got your attention? What was going on?
Yeah, well, attention is a funny thing, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes we hear of something or we're exposed to something and it grabs our attention in a big way. And it's like, aha, it's an aha moment. Mm-hmm. So early on, before I was an acupuncturist, I've been a meditator and a cultivator from a very young age. You know, as a kid, I would sit in the bushes and sing to the moon and things of that sort. So I always had these strange leanings, so to say. Mm. But there was a time I heard of the extraordinary vessels, and they were called the 8 extras at the time. And I saw the characters. I still don't. I don't read Chinese or speak Chinese, but I saw the characters and they seemed extraordinarily familiar to me. And this was in 1970, I was in high school, so 74, 75, and it was at the Miami Beach Public Library, and there was a group of old guys that studied the old Russian classics and this and that, and someone had these movements that they had from the vessels. They were, I would call it, pretty close to some Qigong, and that was that. But I always remained curious about it. Years later, I become an acupuncturist. I hear about the vessels again, and they caught my curiosity.
Yeah. Now, wait a minute. Wait, these were guys studying Russian literature?
No, they were Russian mystics that hung out.
They were
old
Russian
Jewish
mystics.
Russian mystics that hung out in the Miami Beach Public Library. I think I'm safe now to say I used to skip high school and go to the Miami Beach Public Library and hang out with the old Russian guys who were reading Jung and the old mystics and had tattered copies of the Dao De Jing and all these types of things. They were just interesting guys this was the phase of life they were in. And I hung out, and all of it was curious to me. I liked Jung from a very young age too. But I like the fact that he, as a child, he carved a friend out of a pencil that he carried with him when he needed counseling. I don't know if you've heard that story, but that was a story that was told to me. And I'm like, well, okay, that seems like an interesting guy.
Okay, so you didn't let schooling get in the way of your education, is what you're saying.
No, I didn't. I was very good at looking out the window. I figured out in 6th grade how I could get placed so I'd be by the window because there was a tree right outside the window that I could stare at all day and look at the birds come and go. And, Miami people think we don't have seasons, but we do. We have nest building season in the tree and the subtle changes in the weather and the humidity. Things are, dramatically different. So I enjoyed that year by the tree and paid just enough attention to get by.
Yeah. So Russian mystics, I'm just chuckling. It's great. What'd you do when you were a kid? Well, I hung out with these Russian mystics.
Yeah. Well, Miami Beach was a very interesting place at the time. It wasn't called South Beach now. We just called it Southern Miami Beach, but what's now known as South Beach, which is this very youthful international place. When we opened our center in 1982, December was when we opened our first center. And there were, South Beach was filled with basically 2 types of people: elderly Holocaust surviving Jews and a lot of elderly Cuban immigrants. Predominantly, you had these survivors. And a lot of my first patients, when I went into practice and we opened up this integrative center where we were working with MDs and chiropractors and energy healers and massage therapists and all kinds of different things. a lot of our patients, in addition to the very counterculture types, the hippies and countercultures and the artist types who are living the good life there for very little money then, were these Holocaust survivors. And the reality of what a great blessing that was for me today as an older guy who knows what I was the great benefit of, right? And early on, here I'm this young guy, and I would do an acupuncture treatment or make a suggestion, and they'd come back in a week later or a few days later and say, I feel much better. And I would go, oh, you do? It was like I had
really? This works?
Huh? And I remember telling my wife at the time, I'm going to do this as long as it seems to work. And I'm still doing it. So it still seems to be working. But those early exposures to these people who had, varying health issues, lots of them were profoundly over-medicated at the time, but they had these unbelievable life stories. So I'm a curious guy, and I just couldn't help but sit and listen to the stories. Mm-hmm. And they're amazing. And the resilience among these people was incredible. And so early on, I really had, I will call it, I was placed in this position of really being in awe of the people I was working with, being profoundly curious about the people I was working with, and looking for things deeper. So I'm a big fan of believing that we should be empty enough that we may meet our patients where they are when they come to us.
Oh, what a practice. That'll take you a whole life. You can spend your whole life working on that one.
Well, this is one of the things I cultivate. And there's, and I think this is teachable. These are some of the things I try to teach, what are the empty vessel practices that you can do? How do we dissolve our habituated patterns of thinking and our imaginative patterns and our embodied emotional patterns, even our breath, right? So early on, one of the practices that I was taught by one of a completely unrelated to Chinese medicine teacher was, a really good thing you could do to connect with people is try to match their breath. Mm-hmm. So this was an exercise I would do when I was younger. It's something that naturally happens, right? And then to really take on their body postures and things of that sort. But what really happened to me in these early days is that I could see that the patients that were coming to me were coming with simultaneously lower back pains or headaches or whatever they might be. And they were occurring simultaneously with these deep psycho-emotional issues and spiritual issues that they had, that each was sort of adapting to and resolving in their own way. And it threw me right from the get-go out of any hubris that I know better than my patients about them and their life story than they do. And, a thing I like to say is each person I've ever worked with is the world's leading expert on themselves. And that's where I start from.
Yeah.
It's a very important sort of understanding for me. And this is not like a little thing.
It's not a little thing. And I can tell you, it took a number of years of practice before my hubris got beat out of me.
Yeah.
And finally it's like, okay, so what does this person actually need? I'm going to sit here and listen until they just tell me what they need. And they will. And they will.
And they will, and they do.
Yeah.
But, we were talking about Ted Kaptchuk a little earlier. Or very early on, he wrote a piece. I don't know if you can still get it online or not, but what makes a person a patient and a patient a person?
Oh, what a title.
Yeah, it was a great title and a great piece. Mm-hmm. And something, again, these early conversations I was blessed to have with Ted Kaptchuk. His parents actually lived in South Beach at the time. And so I got to know him because he would come down to visit them and things of that sort. And his parents and my parents became friends. It was, it was an interesting time. But again, from early on, because of the dynamic, I was a super young practitioner and I'm dealing with these really wise elders, people who, if you survived the Holocaust and you ended up, and, they spent their days, this really was an interesting thing. They had ended up in this place that ends up being a world-class resort, right? They get up in the morning, they read their newspaper, they'd go across the street and sit in their chairs on the beach under a tree. They would argue the classics and the news of the day, and they'd talk about the kids and the grandkids or whatever else. And they were really living a deeply meaningful life, right? And many of them had practices that they did, and many of them, because they came from Europe, came from family traditions where there was natural medicine in it, right? There was, like, the first time I pulled out cups to do on one of my elderly Eastern European patients, she started to sob and scream bunkus, bunkus,
That's right.
because this was something her grandmother would do to her when she was younger. So that also planted the seed. There's a universality to some of these things that we do. So I think we're off the track of the vessels.
Well, no, I don't think we're off the track at all. And we're not off the track because, look, we're talking about how things are interconnected.
Yes.
And my suspicion about the vessels, there's something very deep about interconnection with these.
Well, yeah. So, yes, I agree with that. And they're more than just interconnected and interconnected. They begin at the place of undifferentiated wholeness. This is where they begin. And so, a lot of these ideas that are in Chinese medicine, they got into my imaginative process in my brain, and then I dropped them down into my body. And basic ideas, like basic sentences, like human beings are the interplay between the descending forces from above and the ascending forces from below. Well, this is foundational to every patient I see, right? Because this really means that we manifest from this undifferentiated wholeness, right? And then we're one of the 10,000 things thinging. We're this thing, right? Here we are.
10,000 things thinging.
That's what we are. There was this day that I thought of the thought, well, we're not so much a thing to which events are happening, but rather a series of events that are thinging at any time. So it's
Okay, so you say that, and I'm thinking one of those great experiments with light. Is it a particle or is it a wave?
Yes.
There it is.
And that's the beauty of it. Yes.
Yeah.
And so this is a profound issues. These are really important issues. Like, I often go back, the more complex the case is, the more I'll go back to these basic foundational issues. And I've transliterated a lot of the Chinese medicine concepts into I think the essence sometimes of what it is that they're trying to communicate. Like, we could spend the rest of our lives just talking about what does it mean to manifest from the interplay between the descending forces from above and the ascending forces from below. And then there are basic concepts like Jing, right? And then I think of prenatal essence. And this relates in a big way to the extraordinary vessels. So if we see Jing or essence, prenatal essence, as what we inherit from our parents, I think we're really limiting the concept of what Jing is. Because on one level, it's what we get from both our parents. But on another deeper level, it's our entire evolutionary inheritance. In other words, it's not just what we inherit from our parents, but it's what we've inherited from the entire human species experience. It's what we inherit from all the animals, what we inherited from the trees, what we inherited from our planet. We evolved as the interplay between the descending forces from above and the ascending forces from below. And in this evolution, we're born with all of that as part of our connectivity. And I think this shows up in a lot of the early wisdom traditions when they talk about how does one connect to this interplay between heaven and earth. The teachers there, right? I call them the teachers of verticality, of this vertical relationship, are the trees and the mountains.
Well, that sounds very Taoist right there.
Yeah. Well, much of my thinking is, let's say, Taoist or proto-Taoist. I spend a lot of time in my imagination and otherwise with the early Wu, the female shamans of ancient, what would now be China, these cave dwellers, from which I think a lot of Taoism emerged. This is just speculative on my part, but the more I speak to friends of mine who are historians, the more they resonate with this. I had this notion for a long time, and I got to interact, and I brought Paul Inschold over here years ago for our symposium. And it's what a pleasure to be able to have conversations about Chinese medicine history with him and my strange and curious notions. And he's like, oh, yeah, this was before the History of Ideas, I think, was out. He's like, yeah, that's all, it evolved from shamanism. And so I think that while I have tremendous, and I don't want this to sound wrong in any way, I have tremendous respect for the written history of Chinese medicine. It's an incredible history. And I have great respect and appreciation for those who are learning Chinese languages. And compared to a few decades ago, the amount of quality translations you can have to these texts is really phenomenal. But for me personally, my path, we all have different paths. I would call that the sunny side of the mountain. I live on the shady side of the mountain. And for me, what they're talking about in those texts is what really captures my imagination, right? What the direct experience. And I think this is where I really start with the extraordinary vessels and my relationship to the extraordinary vessels, is that I really believe that the extraordinary vessels were really part of this great oral tradition for a long time before they leaked up into the written literature. So I believe that lots of what comes into the written literature is around for who knows how long, and then someday someone writes it down. And in the writing of it, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, other sort of distortions come into it. And then, of course, any word, Chinese medicine particularly, we have these symbols, right? But any word, like a word like cultivation or yin yang or qi or blood, these are not just words that we can define with ordinary language, but they're metaphors. And the longer we live with them, the deeper and broader these metaphors get. And the more that different contexts will describe your experience with the metaphor, if I'm making myself clear. And then even deeper still is there symbols, right? And Jung, get back to Jung for a moment. Jung said that signals are pregnant with possibilities. So each of these characters, each of these symbols have limitless possibilities. And the little history I've studied shows me that at different times through the written history of Chinese medicine, different practitioners, different authors and doctors have had very different ideas about what qi is and what blood is, and some very different ideas in their own lifetime. Yes? And so these are operationally the level that each of the extraordinary vessels really operates on. So for me, what we know as the extraordinary vessels, or what they call maybe the pathways, right? They're not really pathways. They would be better, I use the term too, but they would be better understood as flows, right? They're these general flows that are ever consolidating within the body.
I love it. I love it that you use the word flows. Going back to language for a moment.
Yeah.
In language, it's interesting because we write something down and then it becomes solidified. And it becomes a little bit less flexible. I love what you say about metaphor and then even more powerful symbol, because now it's really alive and flowing and moving. But, you say flows. And again, at the beginning of the show, I was saying when I learned how to say these and write these in Chinese, Qi Jing Ba Mai, the word that came to mind to translate this was strange flows. It just came up, and I'm looking to see if other people are writing it down this way, and no one else is writing it down this way, but it has stayed with me. This is how I think about it. I hear you say it. It's like, oh, all right, a little ping from the universe, like keep going in that direction. So thank you.
Yeah, I like that quite a bit, and I think again, I learned a lot of these concepts by reading very varying English definitions for them or translations for them, yes? And so I found out early on as a non-Chinese medicine speaker, what I would do is I would take the character and I would blow it up and I would put it on the wall. And I have a technique that a lot of what I learned is from the moon. So we had the swallow the moon technique, and I would literally swallow these characters as characters and symbols to see what came up for me cognitively and imaginatively. And then I would read a lot of the different translations for these characters. So I was coming at them from some of the translations were just off. So for example, for many years, I found the definition of qi as energy really problematic. Very problematic. For most people, at least in the West, when you would say energy, they thought about this in quantitative terms. And I thought, well, okay, you could use energy if you're thinking about it in qualitative terms, right? Spleen qi deficiency is different if you're thinking about that qualitatively than quantitatively. But still, I would always wrangle around with like trying to use, finest influences or finest material influences or all kinds of different languaging for it until modern times they started to define, get back to what I don't know if we were on air when we mentioned this, they talk about energy as this relationship between waves and particles, which is really a pretty good definition for qi. We come back full circle. So I think I forgot where where we were.
Well, we were talking about how you can write things down and they get a form in a kind of it sticks, but you can also take these things and make them very lively, looking at metaphor, looking at symbol, looking at relationship. This is all stuff that Chinese medicine does really well.
Yes. Well, I think Chinese medicine for me is a metaphoric and symbolic language, much more so than, using ordinary cognitive language. And so when we try to get too ordinary languaged about it, we try to codify it in that way, we really miss the reality that it's metaphoric. And there's a tremendous book I read early on called Metaphors We Live By. I don't know if you've read it. If you haven't, I strongly recommend it, by George Lakoff. And in it, they basically make the point that metaphor is not really just a linguistic device, but that metaphor is actually how human beings experience the world. And so our patients come in and they speak in metaphor, and all of Chinese medicine is metaphor. And sometimes we can attach our metaphor, and the extraordinary vessels are tremendous metaphorically to attach to people so that they can reimagine the metaphor that they come in with. But very few people come in and say, I have a herniated disc at L5, S1. They come in and like, my lower back is killing me. That's a metaphor, right? I feel like somebody punched me in the gut.
Well, and sometimes they do come in with the diagnosis. They will come in and say, I've got this herniation at L4, and they're focused on that. That also tells you something.
Yeah, that does happen, and that's the power of labeling something, right? That comes up sometimes. But then if you talk to them about it, and it's not a long conversation, just like, oh, okay, so what does that feel like for you? And then they're dropping right back into the real world. Well, I feel like an old man when I go to get up in the morning, right? I feel like I have the weight of the world on my shoulders. Whatever language they're speaking in, they're speaking to us in these metaphors because that's how human beings express the world. So Western medicine gets very specific sometimes about like what symptoms need to be for what diagnosis, or you see this and there's that. But that's not really what most people are dealing with in their lived experience, right? And I agree with you 100%. Once they have that diagnosis, and I work with a lot of people. I worked in the 80s and 90s with a lot of HIV patients and AIDS patients. You get that diagnosis, right? It's one of those moments, right? Or a cancer diagnosis. These are very powerful words, but they're also powerful metaphors. So when you ask somebody with an L5 S1 diagnosis, what's your experience of hearing that, or how does that feel? There's a lot to explore there. Now, I'm not trying to impose a broader picture on people, right? So when people come in and say, hey, listen, my back hurts, I'm glad to meet them there and say, this is our entry point. But I think it's always important to set the context, right? That this is a healing context where the broader questions could come out. And one of the beautiful things for me about Chinese medicine is our 4 methods, the way we do our diagnosis, the way we relate to our patients, about touching them and looking at them and listening to them, goes well beyond sort of the inquiry mechanical methods of Western medicine. And these are very powerful things. So people speak to you with their bodies.
This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that honestly just makes running a practice easier. Let's dive into something that's never easy, but sometimes necessary: raising your fees. It can feel awkward, right? But here's a tip that can really help. Consider offering flexibility to your patients as you introduce the change. When patients face new fees, it's natural for them to feel uncertain or concerned. That's where flexibility can really make a difference. Offering options like a phased increase, suggesting a payment plan, or even taking a moment to talk things through can help to ease the transition. These thoughtful gestures show your patients that you're listening and care about them, which strengthens the trust you've worked so hard to build. If you're looking for more ideas on how to navigate these kinds of changes, head to frontdesk.jane.app and check out the article, How to Tell Clients You're Raising Your Fees. One last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, you can use the code CHEOLOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. And their experience, and and their metaphors, of course. It's interesting. You just used the phrase, "What was your experience when you heard that?" Right? Or you got a slip disc, you got a herniated disc. What was your experience when you heard that? I got this cancer diagnosis. What was your experience when you heard that? That is a very powerful question that I hadn't thought about. I mean, I agree with you, and quite often in my clinic, I'm looking to use metaphor because, like you, the world is held together by stories.
Yes.
And that's not just like a beautiful poetic thing to say.
No.
It's really the way it works.
It's reality.
It's reality.
The medicine we practice speaks to that in a way that's really very unique.
Absolutely.
And
agree.
powerful.
Yeah. So thank you for that particular inquiry here, because sometimes I become a little bit, hypnotized isn't the right word, a little bit unskilled, I would say, when people come in and they're very attached to their diagnosis. And I want to help them unattach from it. But sometimes that thing is just really knotted together. And this question about what was your experience when you heard that?
Yeah.
I am looking forward to walking back into clinic and seeing what that'll open up.
Well, it opens up plenty. And it also then is very revealing towards, sort of the psychosocial patterns that a person might be experiencing, more than saying, what's your home life like? I don't recall that I've ever asked that question. Do you get what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
Or what are the social considerations that might be impacting you at this particular moment in time? Yeah, these are the idea that when we're interacting with our patients, we're not just listening for the what they say, but the how they say it.
Yes.
And I put a lot of energy or a lot of emphasis on the affect. In the continuum of the emotional world, you have a person's emotions, and this is what they might be experiencing at any particular point in time. And then you have their affect, which is what they're putting out into the world at any particular point in time. And often affects and the embodied emotional experience don't match. And then I see feelings being sort of like the climate to the emotional weather. So how you process and express these emotions over a period of time comes down into the feeling state. Well, if we learn to really diagnose and understand the affect that people are putting forward, we can really navigate their terrain with them in an entirely new way, because they're speaking to us not just with their words, but with the affect, right? The emotion with which those words are expressed. So, we've all had the experience, I'm sure, of people coming in and being very saying something as almost they're describing something about somebody else, right? They're like listing their mental list of their symptoms. Other people who are fully overwhelmed with what seemingly might be not so dramatic symptoms, but they're really overwhelmed with this. All of this tells us a deeper story. This deeper story for me, the place I organize it is on the level of the extraordinary vessels, which lend themselves to treating these deeper, they're the more deeper primordial fields in the body, we'll say, right? And by primordial, which is really important, primordial as a word means, in terms of time, first in origin, right? Mm-hmm. So if you've studied vessels at all, you know that they evolve before the rest of the bodily anatomy. And it also means, in terms of space, deep and within and behind all other activities. So there's these and they operate on the level of our primordial functions, some very basic primordial functions. So we talked about the verticality of our relationship, right? This relationship between where we emerge there. Well, now we have our horizontality, right? We move through the world and we act on the world and we receive the world. And to the extent, and this is just a little way I'm thinking in my head, to the way that we move through the world, we're manifesting our destiny, and then fate is how we receive the world. So there's this interplay, whether, the fate destiny might get us off here.
Well, this is important because these terms get thrown around a lot in our trade. And it's a big thing sometimes. So I would like to dig into it a little bit. Fate, destiny, their relationship, how it's connected to the 8 extras. More please.
Okay. So, okay. I'm always happy to go to do more please there. So I think it's really important when we use terms that we define them and place them in the context in which we're using them. And some terms dramatically vary depending on the context. So I'm going to define these terms for this particular context.
Good.
I'm going to make a distinction between fate, which is where we find ourselves, right? This moment in time and space into which we're born. And then destiny is how we act, what choices we make, how we navigate this place that we find ourselves in. One of my early Chinese teachers made this distinction saying, fate's your restaurant that you're in, and destiny is what you order off the menu, which is makes the point very beautifully.
Yes.
But it's a little like maybe it's slightly more controlled than I like to think of it, because early on, and this is something I thought about really from a very young age, so this fate and destiny thing is very interesting to me, is, you have people who say it's all fated, right? You're born and that's just what it is. And then there's others that say, no, you create your reality, your every thought, right? And so it's all destiny. You can control your destiny. And one of the beautiful things I learned from Chinese medicine thinking is that there's always these interplay, right? Fate's contained within destiny, destiny's contained within fate. And there's this beautiful interplay between moments, from moment to moment. Sometimes we're being fate dominated. Other times we're being destiny dominated. When we're destiny dominated, it's time for us to go out and to express and process and act on the world. That's, for me, that's under the purview of the Dai, to express and move out to the world. To the extent that we process the world, we accept our fate, that we value make out of those experiences. So for me personally, I don't believe that everything happens for a reason, but I believe that we can make value out of everything that happens to us. And this is under the purview of the inner gate, the yin wei. Right? So there's this pulse between them, right? There's this, as we're navigating any kind of chronic condition, really, right? But particularly depressions, which tend to be a little more Dai dominated, though they involve all the vessels, or anxieties, which tend to be a little more yin wei dominated, although it involves all the vessels. Yes. So there is this idea that to navigate the world with the greatest amount of internal ease, right, and the greatest amount of external grace, that we need to really play and cultivate how we accept and take in and appreciate and value make our fate, and how we act on and manifest our destiny. And this gets back to another one of my favorite concepts that I've been living with like for decades now. And this idea of ride the dragon, it's a really important, metaphors are important. In most Western culture, when we think of the hero's journey, we think of this slay the dragon. What you do is you slay the dragon or you flee the dragon to live another day to make the battle. But you're always, the accomplishment is to slay the dragon. A lot of ancient wisdom traditions, and you find this in ancient parts of China, and they reemerge in medieval times too, is this concept of riding the dragon. That when the dragon appears, you learn how to be in its presence and how to get aboard and how to ride it. So this is a beautiful metaphor for our emotional experiences as we move through the world.
This is really powerful because, yes, the Western story is we slay the dragon and we get the dragon's treasure.
Yes.
A very slight shift in perspective here is the dragon is the treasure.
Well, yes. And more importantly, we're the dragon. So when we learn, let's talk about anger or fear or grief. When we learn to fight our anger dragon, or we learn to fight our fear dragon, when we learn to fight our grief dragon, then this is a cultivation. Everything we do is a cultivation. It's cultivating something, right? Whether it's with intent or with awareness and consciousness or just unconsciously. So we do this. And then after years, a few lunar cycles or a few solar cycles, we've become really good at fighting ourselves, our anger, or fleeing our anger, or fighting our grief or our fears. But on the other hand, if we learn to ride the dragon of our experiences, then in a few lunar cycles and a few solar cycles, we've become proficient at riding the dragons of our emotions internally. We become proficient at doing that. And part of how you do this, there's lots of cultivations and just being, some of these ideas, just to be aware of them. I've said this to many people over the years, both students and patients. And as soon as they hear that, they're like, people with profound depressions, right? Or profound anxiety. It transition it. But from a very practical standpoint, we can use the master couple points and confluence points of the Dai and the Yin Wei here. Again, I'm oversimplifying it just for a point of conversation, but there's really practical things we can do. And so this is what's been really interesting for me with my journey with the extraordinary vessels, because I feel like over the decades, I've become even firmer on my belief that to know the vessels, you have to cultivate the vessels. And you have to cultivate them in as many ways possible. And then when you know them, you can begin to see them in others, between others. You can see these primordial forces playing out both internally and externally. So one of the things we've done to explore the vessels over the years is we've done these really large shared group acupuncture experiences among audiences that come from very different backgrounds. We did one in conjunction with the University of Miami Medical School at one point for they had a functional medicine conference. We had 220 new age, hippies, ordinary people, and medical doctors laying out on the floor, getting the master couple points done together, and then sharing their experiences, and they were having shared experiences, right? This is one of the ways we explore it, and we've been exploring the shared group acupuncture experience as a way of understanding it. The other way is to actually just cultivate it yourself. So from when I first was exposed to this, I've done it every day. I sit there, I do a particular vessel, and I do the master a couple points, and I lay out for 20 to 30 minutes, and it's part of my daily practice. It's what I do. And it's a way to really get to know them, not just as flows or pathways in the body, but as these primordial fields, which manifest, and I don't see this in the written literature to this point, which manifest at what we'll call these fields of influences in the body, which are overlapped to some extent with the flows or the pathways, but are different because we're constantly looking at these vessels both in terms of time and in space. So we talked a little bit about moving, time and space with the vessels.
And vertical and horizontal.
Vertical and horizontal, which, by the way, when you have this interplay between verticality and horizontally, you end up getting all these spiral energies as they flow through the body, right? So I visualize what many people call the macrocosmic orbit, or this flow between heaven and earth as it enters into the body. This is the Chong. This is the Chong flow through the body. And then as you get your first division, evolutionary speaking, you have, the egg and no division. Then as you get your first division, this is very powerful. You have this, what some people call the microcosmic orbit, or you have your Du-Ren flow. And constantly, I read in the Taoist texts, or I hear Taoist talks about there's this problem with, they have this emphasis on the Du rising energy in the back, but they're missing the point. It's not. It's a cycle. It's a circle. And, we know that the Du is contained on the back, is contained within the Ren, and the Ren is, the Du is inside the Ren in the front. And if you understand this as this rising, you're completely missing the part where it's this cycle. It's this recreation of the macrocosmic orbit, this interplay that's happening between heaven and earth. And once you understand it as a flow, right? We reach up for the heavens, we connect down to the earth, we begin to understand it in a different way. And then the next division would be horizontality, would be the Dai, right? So that's the Dai. But the part that really became critical to the work that I do is understanding that the Dai emerged out of the vertical flow, and that it's not a singular event. It's an event that's continuously happening at all times and all people. So when you see the Dai pathway as this horizontal flow, that's just a photograph. But the video would show you that it's constantly cycling from vertical to horizontal. And it's really a lot to do with the propulsion, the rhythm of that microcosmic orbit, or that Du-Ren flow. I hope people can visualize this to a certain extent.
Yeah. Okay. Hang on just 1 second, because I was with you and I actually let me run this by you real quick, because as you were talking about the Du and the Ren, up and down, I had this image of like a torus shape, like a donut, right? It goes up, it comes down like simultaneously, and there's an empty space in the middle. And I can get the idea. So that's your verticality, and then you bring in the horizontal with the Dai.
Right.
And did I just hear you say that it goes vertical? It'll like go horizontal and vertical, and it kind of goes back and forth? Or
yes, that's what I said.
That's what you said.
Just like us. Like us.
So help me understand more the Dai going horizontal and vertical. I've always had this idea that it's just this horizontal thing that knits things together. There's something else here. I don't quite have it. Give me another shot at it.
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting, because we're talking about simultaneously these flows or pathways, and these general interplays between heaven and earth. But human beings, all beings, they move from being in a vertical relationship to a horizontal relationship at all times, right? So it's a rhythm. So to think of these as fixed flows is really, it's calcified. It's not an accurate, to my thing. You're looking at photographs, but what you're seeing is as flows, as humans, right? We have this flow that's coming down and going up simultaneously. It then sort of creates this flow within the body, the same one that's happening outside the body. So from a standing there perspective, we know that at Yong Chuan, kidney 1 at the bottom of the feet, we have these roots that go down in the earth, do 20 at the top of the head. We are receiving the descending forces. This then goes into the body, and you have this microcosmic orbit that's really contains, the Ren and the Du contain within them our inheritance from the earth and from the cosmos, right? So all of our source of yin and yang, before there's like this more somatized view of it, just the basic nourishing in the body. But then as human beings, trees have horizontal relationships too, and so do mountains, but they're very slow. So they're not good teachers for us for that, right? So the better at teaching us horizontality were the animals. And that's why animal poses show up, right? and they move differently, either in the sea or on the land or on the air, right? Different levels. And so they're moving horizontal. So when we're moving horizontally through the world, right, and we're receiving the world as it comes at us, this horizontal relationship, we haven't abandoned our vertical relationship. They occur simultaneously. And in fact, they're not fixed or binary like that, right? They're actually flowing into each other at all times. And this flow is this flow of the die within the body. So this was demonstrated to me. We could go back. We didn't really discuss my whole view, my whole study of the extraordinary vessels is really. I mean, I've heard about other systems because I have students who have studied with other people, and I have friends who have taught. And I know enough about it. And I've read some of the text from like more curiosity. But basically, everything I do comes from interactions that I had in 1986 with a guy who I don't think I ever knew his actual name. He went by the name of Chris Young at the time. And I met him at a school that I was studying and teaching at the time. I was teaching there in sort of a barter to sit in some classes. And he came in and he walked in and whatever dialect he had trouble even communicating in Chinese, but they had somebody who was communicated in Chinese. And he did some little visual things of the vessels with his body. And then he took out a flute-like instrument and played 8 notes, one for each of the vessels, which blew my mind. I mean, I don't know. I have, in my own life experience, I have before and after. And basically at the time, they passed around a little survey. Oh, we don't really want this guy here anymore because, there was, unfortunately, we're already moving towards how is this going to help us in practical terms. And I ran after the guy, and not speaking any language. We had no actual communication by language. I said to him, "You got to teach me." And he was with the other guy, and he was very despondent. He had somehow failed. I found out later his story was that he comes from a female lineage. This was the story I was told. I've never historically documented or anything. And it was 20 something generations. I think one time it was 23, another time it was 26. I've always been confused of how it was. And recently I went back and little notes that I made at the time by memory. I hadn't had paper with him when I was with him. And once I wrote 23 and once I wrote 26, but whatever it was, it came from this family lineage. His mother didn't have a daughter. Long story, he got on a plane. He flew to Oakland, California. He met somebody named Chris Young. He's Chris Young. I met him at this school, and I literally had these few interactions with him. That's all. And the way I spoke to him, the way I talked him into doing it, I was a persuasive young guy. It was like there was no way I was giving up on this. And at the time, we were organizing this big international acupuncture symposium, and I was doing all these more, let's say, serious things. But this was something that I was not going to let go. And I went home, and for several nights, I had very strange dreams, like an old lady with a really bad hobble. And she's talking to me about the vessels in the dream. So I finally got him to agree a few days later, maybe it was a week. I'm not really good with linear time all the time. I got him to meet with me again. And I told him the stories of these 2 or 3 dreams I had. And he said, okay, I'll take you on. Basically. So for I make no claim to any kind of authentic lineage. This is not like I, studied with the guy for years. In these 5 sessions of a few hours where we did not speak the same language, he communicated to me the rudiments, the bones of the system that I've spent the last 37 years sort of fleshing out and studying and observing. And he said a few things to me. He said, definitively, you can't know these if you don't do this every day, do it every day for the rest of your life, no matter what. I mean, this is sort of what got communicated. He communicated these spheres of influence in the body with each of the vessels. He communicated to me very clearly that they were primordial fields that played out outside the body and inside the body. And so, these were things that really, really stuck with me in a profound way. And I noticed on your website, you celebrate curiosity. And I celebrate curiosity too. And for me, there's different kinds of curiosity. I'm curious about that. I want to know more. And every cell of my body is now taken over with curiosity. And this is something that I'm just not going to let go. And so for decades now, I haven't let it go. I've had to explore it in every way possible. You mentioned my research. So early on, we wanted to do a research study. Let me back up again. I didn't teach this to any other practitioners until I had cultivated and used it myself a little bit for a decade. I started to teach it I was teaching in acupuncture schools, but I wasn't teaching this.
You were still learning it.
I was learning it. And the metaphor I like to use is, over the years, I've gone from an occasional tourist to vessel land, right, to within the extraordinary vessels, in my knowledge, to a frequent tourist, to I've moved there, and now I've lived there for decades. And I think for all of us, with all the knowledge that we have or what we take on, it's good this is a metaphor that really works in a lot of situations. I'm sure with the work you do, certain things you were doing it and you were, thrilled that it was working and happening, and you had sort of a cognitive understanding of it. And then at some point, it really became full-bodied, what I call three-womb knowing, cognitively, imaginatively, sensorily, in the body itself and in the breath and in the spirit, right? It's this whole deeper way of knowing. And that's when intuition comes in. But if you haven't cultivated that, I'm not sure, a lot of practitioners say, well, that's my intuition. And I'm like, I get a little worried about it because
I'm the same way. I have often asked myself the question, what's my intuition? What's my imagination? And what's just my hope that someone's going to get better? And I'm going to call that wishful thinking. I think it's really important to be able to discern these.
Yes. Yeah. And I think they're all equally important in their own ways. Do you follow what I'm saying? As long as we are identifying them clearly. I'm a big fan of hope, right? Not false hope, but realistic hope. And when we start to talk about something like hope, which, again, I'm just going to share how my mind thinks, the source of hope, what we would cultivate within the vessels would be the do. But this idea of hope, what happens with hope? We know from positive psychology that hope is a person having a sense of autonomy and pathways. And part of what's really powerful about what we do in Chinese medicine is if we're doing it, I think, in a way that's most robust, we're turning over the autonomy to the patient, yes? And then we're helping them when we can with pathways out of their mess that they're in, with new metaphors, right? A new way of understanding that we have to be also careful as practitioners not to hyperpathologize things like we do in Western medicine. So we're looking for what their strengths and their powers are. And I'm often surprised by people will come to me and I'm looking at them and they've had 20 years of a challenging illness and they're psychologically been beaten down. They've been really losing, let's say, extended family members and friends. And I have a conversation with them. I said, you're unbelievably resilient. Here you are. You haven't given up. You've showed up here today, right? This is an unbelievably powerful context, healing context to create for somebody. And then it's our job to explain to them the best we can. Some more Chinese medicine terminology, others times it's just transliterated into something that they can roll with to give them realistic hope. And, I was surprised at first. I'm no longer surprised that when you map something out for somebody, I just spoke to somebody that I've been working with for 7 or 8 years now. And I remember they reminded me, on our first visit, you told me this is what I could realistically expectate. And this is what I love about the vessels in particular in Chinese medicine, that if I do this, I think in lunar cycles and solar cycles. You said to me, in 3 lunar cycles, there'll be a new piece that I've taken on myself, feel a little different. Then we're getting into the solar cycles. But like 7 or 8 years from now, depending on how it plays out, you're going to look back at this moment and say you don't identify with it anymore. It's going to be dissolved. And they brought this up to me. I didn't, I've had that conversations a lot of time or something like that. And they brought it up to me. And it was, it's one of those moments that reminds me of how blessed we are to do what we do, the power of some of these predictive powers. It's not really prediction, but like things play out, like a stone's rolling down a hill, probably going to reach the bottom of the hill. Things might stop it along the way. And if it gets stopped along the way and you move the obstructions, it's going to find the valley at the end at the bottom of the hill.
It helps when you know the landscape, or you at least have a sense of the landscape, the terrain.
Yes.
That you're moving through. And I'm very struck here. Just want to pause for a second and run this by you. I want to come back to fate and destiny.
Okay.
All right. It's like an inhale and exhale. There's what we got that shows up, the peculiar situation and circumstances that we're born into, and then there's what we do with it.
Yes.
This is very powerful. This idea that we have some agency, and that agency is how we make meaning. That agency is how we go through life. We may not be able to change the circumstances, but we can certainly change the experience.
Yes. And, to varying degrees, right? Depending on how things play out. And sometimes they'll surprise us. So I'm going to go back to those 80s, to the early days. I had a patient who had been diagnosed with AIDS, and he was pretty much end stage when he got to me. And he said, listen, I just want a little more peace in my passing. And I had a lot of people that I work with. And he said, so I work with him. And again, this was early in my working with it. And he died like 4 months later. And I felt upset, not just at his death, but I felt some sort of like a failure, because I was still, a little bit of the eye on the prize. He could have had a little more longevity. I could have done this. I got a phone call. This is pre, texts. And it was his mother. And she had called to thank me, because whatever I had done with him in those last few months of his life, he had mended all of his relationships with his family, and come to peace with the relationship with his father, who his father wanted nothing to do with him, but he came to peace with that. And he mended his relationship with his mothers and sisters, all this mending. And that really was a transformative moment for me in terms of my practice, that sometimes we can get a little narrow focused on how we're measuring this. And the more narrow focused we get, the more egocentric we get about it. Like we did something, right?
Amen, brother. Yep. Been there, done that.
Yes.
Try not to do it too often.
Yeah. Well, I imagine I'll do it. I'll get caught up in it again at some point.
Of course. It'll show up.
I work on it on a regular basis. So as, we talk about this, these issues like fate and destiny, and these are big issues, right? I believe that everybody, simultaneously to having what we'll call the narrow focus issue, has the bigger issues, and that we can set the table for these issues to be addressed. But I believe, with acupuncture, you address them if you do it with no awareness. So, for example, I know an acupuncturist. He used to send me a lot of patients because he wanted to do nothing but work with pain. And if they started talking about psychological stuff or spiritual stuff, he wanted nothing to do with them. And good for him, he knew his role. But what constantly happened with him, he was just going in and had this very somatized view, and he would treat them, and this stuff would come up, because you're not treating an acupuncture point and saying, oh, you're only going to treat the physical, manifestations. And, my deepest held belief, and I believe Chinese medicine sort of supports this as a belief, that there's really not a mind-body interaction. They're co-occurring phenomena, right?
I completely think of it as an entanglement these days.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not so sure they're even entangled as they're the same thing, just playing out on the level of where we see it. So this really plays very deeply into this whole idea of how I work with the extraordinary vessels. You have a thought, right? As human beings, we tend to get into these habituated patterns of thinking or habituated patterns of imagination. And the distinction I make between like ordinary thinking or little c cognition, not big C cognition, and imagination is the senses, right? Where ordinary thinking or cognition is tied to the senses and the imagination is senseless. So when people tell me that's nonsensical or it's senseless, Of course, it's imaginative, right? And this is a really big transition. It just reframed everything for me the day I realized, I'm not only not nonsensical, I'm not just senseless, what I'm saying, it's imaginative.
Yes, you're nonsensical. That's nonsense. Yes, you're right.
You're right. It's imaginative. But this is important because even our imaginations fall into habituated patterns of the way we imagine things. So I'm going to throw this as an idea out to you. Anxiety is a stuck, habituated pattern of the imagination. That's one of the things. And that co-occurs with how the body responds to it. So we have these basic movements in the body, right? We have up. I mean, this is my breaking down of everything of Chinese medicine in terms of 4 movements. We have up, we have down, we have in, and we have out. We have faster, slower, warmer, and hotter. And that's what's playing out in the body, right? So where is it happening? Is it in this up-down pulse? Is it in this expansion-contraction pulse? Are things slowing down, speeding up, heating up, cooling down? These are just sort of the movements of the cosmos as they're playing in our body. And you have a thought, and call it this time an imagination. You're imagining this is going to happen. You have a co-occurring set of physical responses in the body, what I call the embodied emotional world, that are co-occurring with that. And so when one realizes this and they start to recognize that their imagination is stuck, what are they imagining? Well, they're imagining, they're going to, whatever it might be, right? Or sometimes the imagination goes forward and the imagination goes backwards, right? So we're reflecting on something that we had, and we're imagining that somebody heard something we said or we did something in a particular way. That's going backwards, or we're projecting forwards, right? Going forward. This is all verticality. I mean, horizontality in our brains, right? We have this. What a wonderful thing the imagination is. We can move through time and space, but we're caught in this habit of imagining the same thing over and over. So if we do a little something to first point that out, you're just imagining the same thing over and over, right? And where are you imagining this in this body? Where is this? How's it playing out in your body? Not one or the other or how they're reacting. It starts to, just the awareness starts to dissolve this for them. Do you follow what I'm saying? It starts to dissolve. It starts to break the pattern. They're like, I am stuck in my imagination. I never thought of it that way.
Having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things you can do as a healthcare practitioner, because a robust business is the ultimate expression of vital qi, and that's the heart of our medicine. I'm Julie Bairdontlock, and I help practitioners grow nourishing, profitable, authentic businesses that embody the generative cycle of Chinese medicine. This isn't about all yang all the time. It's about expanding your own internal capacity, growing collaborative relationships with your patients for ethical patient retention, and marketing as an extension of this medicine, not a necessary evil. You already know that everything is connected in your patients' lives and bodies. The same is true for your business. When we align your systems, your schedule, your pricing, and your offerings with you, we create flow, which means more spaciousness, more impact, and more joy. When you are in the flow, fully resourced in terms of chi, time, and money, your business becomes a source of healing, not just for your patients, but for you. Let's grow something rooted, radiant, and real. Visit lifeflowconsulting.com to learn more.
That's really powerful right there. Wait a minute, I just made that up. And then I believed it. And then I keep telling myself that.
Yes.
And then I find, of course, that there's all kinds of confirmation bias because I'm looking for it.
Yeah, that's true. And now, of course, you have times where it's not imagination, it's actual threats, right? But if it's, let's talk a little bit about Yang Wei, what I perceive as the outer gate, okay? This is the deepest aspects of where we meet the world. I know we're going through this sort of just dropping little random thoughts, but I think this is the best way to share this, and I appreciate the way you're driving this conversation, let us go here and there. But let's just look at the yang wei or the outer gate. So this is, in terms of space, the outside of the outside in the body, the outside of the outside. The inside of the outside would be the dai. And the yang wei tends to contract, the dai tends to expand. So like if you're going to really look at this anatomically, the whole superficial fascia, the muscles, the tendons, that would be the dai. And right above that, the skin and all the sensory experiences, this is all the yang wei. So when we perceive a threat from the outside, or we get something wonderful from the outside, whether it's a real threat, like someone yelling at us, right, or throwing something at us, or an imaginative threat where we're perceiving something is happening, the response on the level of contraction in the body is identical. And there are people looking at these now, and it's almost, you almost can't distinguish between the two. But most importantly is there's this habituated response. So there you got somebody, let's say they're a child, and they're growing up in a threatening environment. So they learn on the level of the yang wei, which is protecting yourself from the world, what you let in, right? And the dai, what you express out into the world. They learn to not express out into the world because the consequences are extreme when they say something in a threatening environment. And they also learn to contract. They're contracting all the time. And so after a while, the thinking pattern and the body pattern becomes habituated. At some point later on, they're out of that threatening environment. They're no longer there. Now, a lot of people will recreate that same environment in their adult lives because human beings like the familiar. But those who don't, what happens is they can go to therapy, and I've worked with a lot of therapists over the years who send me patients to what they say, do that thing that you do with the body to get to get them synced up. I'm like, I'm all in. But they can start to change their imaginations and their cognition, right? They start to realize they're not in that, but the body habit just goes on. It just continues to exist. So then we can go in and we can work the yang wei, and we can work the dai, and then we begin to dissolve these patterns. A really profound area I'll share with you about the dai in terms of psychosocial considerations would be early on, I worked with a lot of young women who were cutters. And to me, every cutter is just trying to, like, they talk about the tension builds, it builds, and they do a little cutting. They feel better because they're literally relaxing the dai. And I've examined where girls tend to cut themselves. And I've had one boy cutter ever, so I'm saying girls. And they tend to do releasing along yang channels or gallbladder channels, triple burner channels. A lot of times it's in the abdomen because they're less visible to be seen, but they're right on the dai points. And many years ago, I had one of these girls come in with their mother. And what happens is they're told, don't cut. Do anything you want, but don't cut. And of course, what that does is it exaggerates the problem even more. They're being told, don't do the self-care practice that you've come up with. So the very first time, and this is, sometimes I'm compelled by the circumstances to step into a territory. I try to be pretty soft with most things and accepting of what the parents are going through. But this little girl, she was just really, I think she was, slipping into the suicidal components of being a cutter. So I said, let me tell you what you've done. And I showed her the point. She was really brilliant. She was cutting herself on gallbladder 41 and along the dye pathway of the. I said, you're treating yourself.
You're brilliant, kid.
You're brilliant. You're releasing the tension below the surface. She says, this is what I tell them. Then I feel better and I can go for a while. And I said, let me teach you about finger needling. And I use the word brilliant. What a brilliant adaptation you've come. And here's another one. And she finger needle gallbladder 41. And I taught her some home care that we were doing at the time, and, but the next day I get a call from her therapist, and her therapist is literally shouting at me, really upset. How dare you tell her that this was a brilliant strategy on her part, and she's going on. And I said, listen, let's just chat. And I had because about 1 minute in, I knew that this woman had been and still was a cutter. I could hear it. right? I could feel it. I had a deep knowing about it.
Yeah, no wonder she's an expert in it.
Well, yeah, and a lot of therapists go into listen, you're an acupuncture. I imagine
Yes.
you went into acupuncture to
No, I get it.
explore all your weird stuff too. I'm that way too, right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great way to explore your weird stuff.
Yeah, what a beautiful thing. From the weird interesting to the weird interesting to the weird, this is really a problem, right? So it runs the gamut.
Yes, absolutely.
But I had this beautiful conversation with her, and she ended up becoming a long-term client, patient, and I ended up working with lots of cutters. And this is the extreme, right? But this lack of capacity to express out in the world. I'm friends with Steve Cowan, and we do a lot of work together. We play around with the symbols together. And, we actually did a workshop, I think about 7 years ago, on the Chong for 2 days, where I would just ramble on. He said, this is your opportunity. Just talk about the Chong. So I would talk about the Chong. Behind me, he would draw characters. And we had my niece, who's a choreographer and dancer from New York, would dance what he was drawing, and another person was playing music. It's like, how am I going to teach again after this, right? 2 days of just talking. We painted symbols on stones, played with it was this beautiful dance with it. But really, this is the way to learn it. If I were going to really do a new acupuncture school, this is what it would be. It would be, lectures combined with simultaneous drawings and dance and sound, where it goes into that deeper level. But understanding it from this full-blooded way, right? When you see it, you start to see in our culture today how bound up most everybody die is, right? And the die gets bound up not just with tension right below the surface, but we're going to go back for a minute, if I can, to this horizontally to verticality, right? And verticality back to horizontal. This constant flow of this die, not the die pathway flow, but this deeper, more primordial field flow. And so what ends up happening is it gets, we'll call it the word stuck or stagnant in very predictable and habituated ways. And these play out in the body as these figure eight flows. So one of the most profound figure eight flows that this wasn't taught to me by anybody, I discovered in my looking, and I saw it time and time again, was that the upper back, right around where the die plays out a lot, we call these die mounds, which are around UB 13, 14, UB 17, 18. There'll be two spots on the back when someone's really died up that come up. And this is palpable. And they get, the shoulders get pulled in, right? Or they get indented or they get really raised up, but there's something that's going on that level. And that flow gets congested. And there's this flow that goes from the upper back, dives down into the body, crosses over like a figure eight at the navel, at kidney 16. There's this little die cycle of flow there. And then goes down. The bottom of the eight is in the pelvis. And so there's two ways to see this. There's two major plays that we have here. All of these Chong issues of the pelvis that weren't responding to a lot of attention and energy was because there's this blocked, let's say, metaflow behind it, right? Not just the flow in the pelvis itself or the channels or pathways. And when I began to, we'll call it liberate the die or relax the die with needling and cupping and drag cupping and herbal rolling and gua sha in the back, it opens up this figure eight flow and it gets the die going back into it's proper sort of constant rotating between horizontal and vertical. I would say if there's a singular thing that I've noticed over the years is that everybody has this die blockage, or most everybody. When I taught this years ago out in California at the ACTCM there was some really, Ephraim actually was the one that got them to invite me out, and Steve was when I met him for the first time, Cowan, and I don't know, Joe Helms, who's the head of the medical lab. He was an old friend from when we did the symposium. He showed up, and all of a sudden I'm this guy from Miami talking in California, and because these other guys had enrolled, it was like a packed house, and I'm just doing my thing because I have an outline when I teach. I'm a little more linear than this, but I still just want to immerse people in it, and part of that is doing these shared group acupunctures. And several of the practitioners who I have great and deep respect for came out of that and said, I'm just going to go to this to all my patients. I'm just going to see how this plays out, this bound up Dai thing, this Dai Chong. And there's a Dai microcosmic orb, or Dai Du Ren. And so as I've advanced over the last decade of working with this, I've gotten a lot more into a lot of the master couple combination treatments, using a lot of the topical applications of really understanding it to next level work. And this is kind of the stuff I discuss in treating depression, right? In treating anxiety, in treating chronic pain, all these chronic things, all these complex things that show up in a lot of different channels and pathways, and you end up getting into this chasing syndrome, can benefit from some addressing on this deeper, more primordial level, on the flow levels, on these field levels of the extraordinary vessels. And so this is not, most of the people who study with me don't do it instead of everything else they do, but they're like, today is a good day to really address it on this level. And it's very practical too. It's not, this is what the thing I love about Chinese medicine and acupuncture. I'm sure you do too. I don't know if it's always going to work, but there's always something to do, right? It's like, we can figure out an idea. Rub this, eat that, swallow this, breathe this, and there's some way to address it. And there is a way to address these deeper, more primordial issues that people come into the clinic with. So that's what I've been exploring all these years.
Wow. Well, holy smokes, man, there's just so much in this. Really grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you about it. I've been sitting here on the other end of the microphone, just kind of absorbing it a bit. I mean, literally absorbing it. And you're talking about having a felt sense. I'm really curious to know what the listeners might be getting as well, right? We're kind of getting a treatment here in a sense. I'm definitely going to investigate this thing with the diet. And thank goodness there's a recording so I can go back and listen to it again. But the felt sense of there's this deeper thing that's a bit out of whack. And it's created its own little sort of, I think about a stream, and there's these little eddies that can happen. It gets very stagnant in there. It doesn't flow down the stream. You get caught in these little flows off to the edge, and you just go round and round and round and round and round. This sounds like a way of addressing that. Like you, the joy of clinic is maybe you see something, you cotton onto something, you go, oh, wait a minute, look at that. I wonder if that's really what's going on here. Well, I'll investigate it by attending to it. I'll treat that. We'll see what happens, right? It's a great way to spend the day because you get to be curious, you get to help people, you get to learn things. So there's that.
Yeah, I think I want to say, if I can interject, what you're alluding to here is that for us, diagnosis is treatment, and treatment is diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. And it's all an exploration.
It's an exploration.
This for me is the really joyful thing, is being able to come back to, I wonder if this is what's going on. Okay. Well, if it is, then how would I address that in a focused, helpful way? That when they come back in a week, maybe we'll notice something. Or maybe they come back in a moon cycle. Or they come back in a seasonal cycle.
Or a decade.
Yeah, I am constantly reminding my patients that they've lived into something, and it takes time to live your way back out of it.
Yeah.
One of the problems that I see with acupuncture is on occasion you'll get these tremendous, brilliant, burst of light and everything's different. Wow, acupuncture is magic. Okay, that's kind of fun in a way, but it also gets in the way of really doing the work.
It can.
It does for me.
Yeah. I could see that. We get distracted by it and we keep looking for it, and that can be particularly problematic.
I think so.
And then you get into more and more into this technique and that technique, instead of understanding or really being with the process and seeing that certain things flow differently.
Yes, exactly. Or patients go out and they say, this guy cured me with one treatment. It's like, oh, great. You're going to go tell people they're going to come to me and we're going to have to work with something different.
Well, I think that when you address people and you place them. For me, I have a healing model. I know it's off track a little bit again, but my healing models evolved from like the traditional medical model. Again, we're vertical, right? There's the expert telling down, and then it became very popular in Chinese medicine, acupuncture, and alternative medicine community to talk about this horizontal relationship. Where we're like working together with our patients, our clients. And that's dissolved for me along the way. And now I have sort of a mandala model. And I actually draw this out with my patients all the time. So there's a big circle. And in the middle of the circle is them. And then I ask them, let's say, I just did this the other day with a cancer patient. And I said, the amount of trust you have for that person, draw the circle bigger before you place it in the circle. How important they are to you at this moment in time, right? Place it closer to you. So, for example, their mother, who may not have very much medical expertise, is right close to the center of the circle, but a small circle. Where their oncologist, this one woman drew the oncologist as a big circle. He's very important to her right now, but put her like literally outside her circle. Like this is where they go. And I just had them place all their different practitioners. I was a fairly big circle, kind of close to the circle, not as close as the mother. And understanding this dynamic that this is really what patients have in their lives. They have all these different influences, and asking them to have an inflated sense of trust for us, right? Or value placement on what we say. I mean, I'm always shocked if anybody listens to anything I say, less so now than, 40 plus years ago, but it's an amazing amount that they turn over to us to begin with. And I think it's important that we don't feed a high level of misplaced trust. So I want to continue with this story. So I happen to know this oncologist, and they're a good guy. They're caring. And they actually, I think Yale and Harvard, they had these patient encounter classes, and he might have taken that because he uses some of the techniques. They teach you, touch the patient one time in a non-threatening manner, sit down, don't just stand up, ask them 2 unrelated questions to their medical situation, little basic things to try to make themselves more human. But the ones I see doing these things, I know at least cared enough to take the course. So there's some spark in them. So I've spoken to this guy over the years about Chinese herbs, if they're safe or not with certain patients, and so on and so forth. And I got the opportunity to speak to him about 3 months into him working with this woman. And he said, Dan, I got to tell you this. I had this weird thrill today. And I said, what? He said, well, my patient brought in her drawings that she said you have her do. And I was this big circle, and I've moved from outside the circle to the middle of the circle. And I felt thrilled about it. And I was like, never imagined it being used in that way. But this woman had actually taken it and said, I'm showing it to my doctor. He said, you've gone from here to here. Now you keep it up. You're going to get even closer to the inner sanctum. And wow. Yeah. So it's an interesting, for me, it's part of the dynamic, and it's nonlinear.
It's nonlinear. I've always loved Venn diagrams.
Yeah.
Because they just show you all these like weird things that you wouldn't otherwise look at unless you pause for a moment and go look at them. So this mandala is like a series of Venn diagrams. And wow, the relationships. I mean, look, with Chinese medicine, with acupuncture in particular, we're constantly looking at relationships. What a great way to get a glimpse. And I also want to come back to something you said earlier about the girl who was cutting and taking that otherwise troublesome behavior and recognizing the goodness that was in it and the helpfulness that was in it, and saying, you know what, kid, you're on the right track. You're not on the wrong track. You're on the right track. Here's some ways to get even better at what you're already doing. That is, it's transformative.
Oh yeah, it was it was transformative for her, and it was transformative for me. An experience like that, because we have ideas, right? We have ideas that float around in our head, and then sometimes we have the opportunity to implement these ideas. And I got to tell you, I don't think trepidatious was the word, but it was an overwhelming sense of obligation to let this girl know that from my perspective, this is how it was. And, navigating that terrain opens something up. The benefit that moment, that interplay with that young woman did, transformed the interplay of how I interacted with all my patients forevermore. Just a little less rigid, right? About the distinction, a little more heart to heart, a little bit more out of the mind. Because she was compelling, and it was so desperate. And I could see her mother talking to her about it. And she would, what we call die up, like contract and bound up her energy. And I could just watch it happening. And I heard her talk about cutting in this very like shamanistic spiritual way. She says, it's this, I said, well, what does it do for you? And she said, and I know this is audio, we're seeing each other, but she sort of tossed her head back and relaxed her shoulders and like with a sigh in her voice said, it's just such a beautiful release, which was really right on, right? That's the die release. It's a sigh, and it just feels beautiful to be unbound, right? Just for a little bit. And this is what she was doing. And I ended up with another person who I was having finger needle gallbladder 41 for their die, who one of my favorite experiences with along these same lines was this was a young man. He had real anger issues. I like to say that the die is contagious. Bound up dies are contagious. And it's like the father's at work. In this case, this is the truth for this kid. The father was at work where he was abused. He couldn't say anything. He came home to the mother. The mother, he would explode on the mother. The die really, if it doesn't come out slowly, it's going to explode out. Then the mother couldn't say anything. She was afraid of the violent husband. And then the mother would explode on the kid, right? And then the kid would not say anything with the mother, who could overpower him. And he'd go to school the next day, and no one would understand why he would smack the kid in front of him behind the head for no apparent reason, which, by the way, this is a very nice die movement sort of release. He was like actually doing it. So he got referred to me by the school therapist they had sent him to. At the time, I was on the Miami-Dade County School Health Advisory Committee, the School Board Health Advisory Committee, which is a whole nother story. I didn't last there too long there. You can only be outvoted 17-1 so many times. But I wrote this kid a note. He had a very oppressive teacher that the school refused to take him out of. They said, you got to learn to get along with him. So I wrote him a note that he was allowed to remove his shoes and socks. It was medically necessary so that he could massage his feet upon medical instructions. And he was be allowed to do this at any time, which just being able to take off his shoes and socks, despite his teacher's wishes, was a big die release and gave him back some control. But he would also do the points, the self-massage on those points. So writing that note released my die, if you know what I mean, for all the times I couldn't speak out or exercise in class. And it was, it's these opportunities that we find ourselves in our clinic, right? In our relationships with our patients that go well beyond like choosing acupuncture points, right? The words we choose are really important. The affects we use are really important. The body postures we take are really important. And again, this is a place where the vessels come in for me, the extraordinary vessels, in being that people embody particular gaits when they're being dominated by a particular vessel. They have certain postures, and you can posturally slowly mirror back to them the shifts in these postures, because these, again, are habituated patterns. And these are things that we've observed for decades. So they're, I don't know, again, what constitutes like legitimate new knowledge, right? But for me, I've tried to explore it in as many ways that we possibly can. In my personal cultivations, in my private practice, seeing that's translatable by teaching it to numbers of other peoples, both acupuncturists and non-acupuncturists and cultivators. Early on, I started teaching this to mixed groups, as we call it, not just acupuncturists, because the therapist and the body workers could ask questions and pursue areas that the acupuncturists weren't. right?
Absolutely. And if you're a body worker of some sort, now you've got the capacity to put your hands on people, and that's really helpful. And even if you're a therapist, gosh, just knowing these and being able to shift your posture or voice, or
Exactly.
that's very potent.
Yes. Yeah. So to me, this is all part of what we do. And it's the brilliance of what's been handed down to us. And again, back to the 4 methods. We tend to get stuck on inquiry, right? We overemphasize inquiry, in my opinion. Observing, listening, when you start to listen for the affect and observe the gait, you can learn a lot by watching a person stand up in their chair and walk to the table. You could see a die in its last grasps for, source chi there. They're trying to pick itself up, and it's prolapsed in its effort to like draw on the fire, even to go from the chair to the table, which is also accompanied a lot of times. It's a physical thing. It could be a sense of a hopelessness. So this is the area that really gets exciting for me, that I had to figure out what it was. A lot of it went backwards. I had to translate what it was I was seeing and then understand it for myself, teach it sort of to my little inner sanctum of students there and see if it was translatable, and then put it out there for a period of time. So what I teach, while, it's no way could we even say it's classically based. I love the classics, and I read them from an interest standpoint, but it's very, very based on sort of some of the fundamental principles and tools of Chinese medicine, and decades of applying it in every context I can possibly think of, applying it. So I've taught it in medical schools and acupuncture colleges, and I've taught it on ashrams. There was a guru who passed away one time who I went to their ashram, and I spent 2 days just sharing people using the vessels to get through the grief process, and how each person identified their grief and which vessel they identified it in. And they all felt better, and they were all able to grasp some of the basic principles, like as you're moving through time and space and how everybody processes loss. Now, there's some overlap, of course, right? But there's also distinct differences in the habituated patterns that people develop in response to moving through the world and receiving the world.
Yeah, this is one of the things I deeply appreciate about Chinese medicine, is that it has the potential to give us that vision. It gives us a set of tools for seeing how each of us are individual, how our habituations, often very helpful coping mechanisms at one point, become, again, habituated is a great word. They become ingrained in a way. They become somaticized.
Yes.
Oh, now we're losing some flexibility. And we've only got a certain amount of choices because things aren't moving in the complete way that they can.
Yeah.
The die is stuck. That vertical horizontal. Man, I'm looking forward to exploring that in clinic. Ooh, can't wait. And exploring it in myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to start with that.
Yeah. I'll get you a couple of videos that will help you where we demonstrate what we call drag cupping the die and cupping the die to release that die.
Okay, we'll pull out the bonky.
Yeah, the bonky.
Pull out the bonky.
Hey.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Daniel, this has been a really nourishing, enjoyable bit of time. I'm a little bit speechless at the moment. I'm the guy who usually has something to say. There's a lot here. I really appreciate your time. In a way, a somatic walkthrough of certain aspects of the extraordinary vessels.
Yes. A lot of ways to know them.
A lot of ways to know them. Anything else that you would like to share with our listeners before we wind this down for the day?
No, I appreciate you having me on for this conversation. I enjoyed it. My friend Ephraim Korngold told me that He suggested / insisted that we should have this conversation, that we need to know each other, and I'm glad he did. It's been enjoyable. I look forward to perhaps more conversing in the future, more dialoguing. I think of this word dialogue, which I like. The John O'Donohue, the Irish writer and poet.
Ah, yes.
Brilliant guy. If you haven't read his stuff, he never wrote a bad line. Passed away a few years ago now. But he defined the word dialogue. He broke it down, and it means to cross the threshold. Mm. And I feel like we cross some thresholds today in our communication. And I really appreciate that, just all the thresholds, the feeling threshold and the spirit threshold and the thinking threshold. And the imaginative threshold. So I enjoyed it.
I as well. All right. Well, till next time then.
Okay. Have a beautiful day.
The first time I saw the Chinese for extraordinary vessels, I remember translating it as strange flows. I thought about them this way, even though I don't say it much in public. After this conversation with Dan, yes, I'm willing to own this initial sense of the name, and beyond that, the influence and potency of these strange primordial flows. I found it curious in the course of this conversation. There were moments I felt like I was simultaneously listening and remembering, like graspable wisps of a dream, like recalling something forgotten but yet known. Dan's thoughts on how fate is where we find ourselves and destiny is what we do with that, it reminds me of the Chinese term yuan feng, commonly translated as fate, but really it means opportunity meets willingness. Yuan feng, that potent moment where fate and destiny intersect. It's a sweet spot. I suspect you know something of this. I too have had my experiences. Sometimes in our clinical work, we get to be present when this arises in our patients. We are not disconnected from that, nor are we the source of it. It is a bit of a mystery, don't you think? From this conversation, I have a sense that there's a kind of attunement that allows for an opening of the connection that we already have to the strange flows. For myself, I'm taking it as a potent inquiry. Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.